Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Leopoldo López. Leopoldo is a Venezuelan political leader, pro-democracy activist, and Sakharov Prize laureate. He is the founder and national coordinator of the political party Voluntad Popular. Leopoldo is also a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Latin American program. He joins us to discuss his Wilson Center project, Facing the Rise of Authoritarianism. Leopoldo, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for you and your team.
A great pleasure and an honor to have you with us. I want to begin. We'll bounce around a bit. We'll look at the big picture and we'll look at Venezuela and your experience specifically. And that's where I'd like to begin. Since we've been talking about doing this interview, the news broke that the Biden administration is considering easing sanctions on Venezuela. I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, sanctions are a means to an end. They're not an end in itself. So if sanctions can promote a meaningful advance towards free and fair elections, that's what sanctions are for. However, what I don't believe should happen is lifting sanctions with nothing in return. Sanctions were imposed because Maduro is a dictator, because Maduro has stole the elections, the presidential and the parliamentary elections. That's why he is not recognized by the US and many other countries as the legitimate president. So if sanctions can provide a ledger towards the path to free and fair elections, that's something we can support. And we actually support. And that's where the US administration is. They have been very clear in recent weeks about the commitment to provide support to a meaningful advance in a negotiated agreement towards free and fair elections.
I want to share this with you. You may have read it. Edgar Beltran, a Venezuelan journalist, he wrote yesterday, Venezuelan propaganda has moved the world to believe that the economic and humanitarian crises in the country are due to U.S. sanctions. He says that claim is a blatant lie. What effect have the sanctions had, and what is the root cause of the problems?
Well, I fully agree with that statement, and I've been actually of that same position for all throughout this time since sanctions were imposed. It's very common that the autocratic regimes always look for an external enemy, and of course the United States is the favorite when external enemies come to the narrative of dictators. It's what Fidel Castro and the Cuban regime did for many, many decades, and it's what Maduro tries to emulate. That is not true. The crisis in Venezuela is a crisis that has a very concrete origin, the dictatorship and the corruption of Nicolás Maduro. The human tragedy that Venezuelans are facing today that have led to an exodus of more than 7 million Venezuelans of a population of 30 million it started way before the imposition of sanctions. So it is not true that the sanctions are the origin of the problem. And it's also not true that sanctions are the root of the suffering of the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people are suffering because of a dictatorship.
In a country like the United States, people can take for granted the ability they have to question and to challenge their government and to protest. You talk about the human cost. You've paid a cost yourself. Would you tell people who may not be familiar your personal story and what the price of opposition has meant for you and your family?
Well, I can tell you very briefly. I am from Venezuela. I was elected mayor in the year 2000, re-elected with more than 80% year 2004. Year 2008, I was running for governor of Caracas, and I was simply disqualified to run for office. I had very good, very strong polling numbers, and since they couldn't win with the ballot box, they just took me out of the race. At that moment, I started a movement, a political and social movement called Voluntad Popular. Our main focus was to confront the dictatorship. So we organized thousands of people around the tactics and the strategic view of nonviolence mobilization, grassroots activism. And in the year 2014, we called for protests. Tens of thousands of people came out to the streets. One of those protests, the officers of the Minister of Interior killed 3 people, and they blamed me for the violence that was happening in the streets of Caracas. So that took me to be in hiding for several days. And February 18th of 2014, I turned myself and I was sent to a military prison where I spent the next 4 years in solitary confinement. I was sentenced to 14 years in prison. In 2017, by the end of 2017, I was sent to house arrest. From house arrest, I called for the people to continue to protest, and at that day, I was sent back to military prison. Then I was sent back to house arrest, from where I was able to escape in April of 2019. And between April 2019 and the end of 2020, I lived in the Spanish embassy in Caracas, from where I escaped by the end of 2020. Since then, I've been in exile, and I'm currently working at the Wilson Center as a scholar for public policy, as you said.
And would you tell us about the project you're working on? You're looking at the bigger picture beyond even your personal experience and Venezuela. Are you finding commonalities across the globe in the techniques or the strategies that autocratic rulers employ?
Very much so. I actually was faced with one question over and over after I left Venezuela. And that question was, why is Maduro still in power? And that was a question asked by presidents of governments and also by people in the streets. And there are many ways to answer this question. One could argue that it's because he has the support of the military or the access to economic funding, or others claim that it's because of the division of the opposition. But the reality is that Maduro is still in power because of the support he has from very mighty powers: China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Cuba, which are all adversaries and even enemies of the United States. So this support that works in a networked way, they are articulated, and they provide Maduro with financial support, military support, intelligence, diplomatic, and strategic support. And in my view, that's the reason above the rest of why Maduro is still in power. So I started talking to different people that live within autocratic regimes, and their view of why the dictators are still holding to power is very similar. So I am working at the Wilson Center in identifying how there has been a rise in autocratic regimes over the past years, how there has been a recession in democracy, but specifically talking about the need to create an alliance of democratic movements that can also support each other, that can also advocate in an articulated way for different policies that should be implemented from the United States, Europe, and other countries. So that's where I'm focusing my research at the Wilson Center.
So if supporters of Maduro's regime, whether Russia, China, others you mentioned, if they're providing financial support, military support, that counterbalance, the thing that you're talking about organizing, where democratically inclined countries would provide support to the opposition, or at least a counterbalance to those who would support an autocrat, what are the specific types of things that they can provide to either opposition leaders like yourselves or others within the country that could turn the tide?
Well, I think the most important gain from an alliance of the sort is to get together leaders and movements that are isolated from each other. I am from Venezuela, as we said before, and we had little until this year communication and common approaches with the other two dictatorships in the American continent, Cuba and Nicaragua. So now we're bringing together the opposition movements of these three countries, but we believe that this needs to happen at a global level. In that way, we can, as I said before, learn from each other and support each other. But then we have identified a series of policy recommendations that could be implemented by the US, European countries, and other liberal democracies. For example, the support of grassroots activism towards movements that are fighting for freedom in the streets, that are organizing civil resistance, nonviolent. Let me be very clear: nonviolent civil resistance. That requires an understanding of how these movements work and what type of support needs to be given. I can give you an example that I think could be familiar to those listening to us today. Over the past 4 years, we have seen tens of thousands of people in the streets of Belarus, of Russia, of Zimbabwe, of Nicaragua, of Venezuela, of Hong Kong. But unfortunately, in all of those places, the outcome has been the same. There has been a spike in the protests and then a fade away. and the opposition movements have been crushed. Many of the leaders are either in prison or in exile, and the outcome has been that the dictators are still there. So we believe that there are many lessons to be learned, because the way in which dictators from Hong Kong to Belarus to Venezuela confront this street protest is very, very similar. Not only similar, but they support each other. So we are thinking of ways in which we can learn from the recent movements and become more effective. Also, the support of training for grassroots activism. Also, understanding that there is a cyber warfare and a disinformation warfare where the Russians are very effective, but the Chinese are also providing a lot of technology. And that needs to be part of the considerations in the struggle for freedom. To put it in a way, Ukraine is at a very dramatic front line in this clash between autocracy and democracy, but it's not the only front line. Venezuela is a front line, Hong Kong is a front line, Belarus is a front line, Zimbabwe is a front line, Rwanda is a front line, Nicaragua and Cuba. So what we want to provide is an understanding where we can connect the dots of how these autocracies are working in a very synchronized way, and also providing some ideas about how we can synchronize the freedom movements around the world.
You mentioned disinformation and what another generation might have referred to as strictly propaganda. Now we talk about as online disinformation. Why is it important to autocrats to attempt to maintain the pretense of democratic rule?
Well, they are very interested in dividing the opposition movements and in creating a narrative. Even yesterday, there was a statement that was very surprising by a member of the Chinese Foreign Affairs office, where they were talking about the need for them to define how democracies are considered. So now we have China talking about democracy. We have China saying that the approach of democracy understood as a liberal democracy, which is, free and fair elections, the respect to the rule of law, the respect of human rights and civil liberties, which is very basic and something that it's at the core of what we understand as a democracy. Well, China now is threatening or challenging this idea and saying, no, we have our own view of what is a democracy. And this all plays out in the narrative field. So it's very important that we can provide support for accurate information, or we can provide support for information to go to the millions of people who are living under autocratic regimes, because they have a propaganda machine where they invest millions and millions of dollars to present their own narrative, and also to attack the integrity of many of the freedom leaders all over the world.
Certainly, the hope is that eventually the truth finds a way. But in recent years, in many countries, including we've seen these impulses here in the United States with populist leaders who use the same language as authoritarian leaders. When you look at the bigger trend and what we've been seeing for the past decade or so, why do you think that authoritarianism, autocratic leaders are gaining footholds? Why are they able to convince people, even if it's not a majority of people, to stick with them?
Well, I think when we talk about democracy and the threats of autocracy, we need to at least understand that there are three levels. There is the discussion about democracy and autocracy in the US and in European countries. That's at one level. Then you have democracies that are at risk. You could say Poland, Hungary, Brazil, Colombia could be countries in that category of democracies at risk. And then you have a third layer or tier that are the autocracies, places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Belarus, Russia. So having a clear understanding of that, there has been a rise of autocracy in several countries of the talk and the populism that comes with the autocratic narrative. But then in autocratic regimes like Venezuela, you have the dismantling of democracy, of the rule of law, and that comes with a narrative that provides an explanation of why people are having problems. And this, in the end, it's a playbook. They always identify an external enemy. It's usually the United States. Usually they identify an internal enemy as well, which is the opposition movements. And they also identify the past enemy, which is the ancien regime. And this is a playbook that is very, very similar in all of the continents. So this is what we are seeing, and this is what we need to confront. And yes, there has been clearly a rise in autocracies over the past 16 years. There has been a recession in democratic governments around the world, and I believe that this has to do with the fact that there is an expansionist strategy by mighty powers like China and Russia, but also, and this is looking inwards, because of the lack of delivery to the problems of the great majority of the peoples that are questioning democracy. So I had the opportunity to live in the United States during the 90s, where I studied. And I remember at that time, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a great enthusiasm and idealism around democracy and freedom. I remember, professors, students, and people going to Eastern Europe, Latin America, Asia to provide support for this growth in democracy. Unfortunately, that idealism and that engagement with the concept, with the idea, with the commitment to democracy and freedom is no longer there. I think that changed in a way after the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. And I think in a way, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine is an opportunity to ignite this idealism worldwide, that this is no conspiracy theory. It's true, it's happening. Autocracies are on the rise, they are working together, and they have identified a common enemy, liberal democracy.
Leopoldo, it sounds like you're describing from the fall of the wall and the hope that sprung from that and the end of the Soviet Union to where we are today, that complacency set in and that Ukraine is a wake-up call.
I believe so. I believe Ukraine is a wake-up call. There are many, many explanations of why Putin invaded Ukraine, but I find the most compelling reasoning behind this is because Ukraine is a democracy with its faults, with its problems, but it is a democracy. And for Russia to have in its borders a democracy that can provide to the Russian people the hope of what a democracy is like, of what a democracy can provide, of the opportunities that are within a democracy, was the clear and present danger that was big enough that justified for Putin the invasion. I think that that it was more the threat of a democracy at the borders of Russia than even the expansion of NATO. And it's been very clear that if that's true for Russia, for China, there needs to be a wake-up call. There needs to be a wake-up call in the U.S., not just the government, but also the public opinion, and also in Europe, that democracy cannot be taken for granted. Democracy is fragile, and democracy is under attack. And if we assume that this is true, there is a lot to be done in the front lines of freedom. And that's where I'm focusing my research.
As we sit here recording this conversation, the people are gathering on the west coast of the United States for the Summit of the Americas. Do you have any hope that something tangible can emerge from the Summit of the Americas that could show some regional unity that could begin to tip the scales?
Well, I would hope that there is a commitment to what was signed by all of the countries in the American hemisphere in September 11th of 2001, the same day of 9/11. The governments were in Lima and they signed a commitment to democracy, the respect for the rule of law and human rights. Unfortunately, the region has been going in a different direction. So what I would hope is that there is a commitment to this. I have seen with great interest how countries from the Caribbean, Mexico, Argentina, they have been questioning the decision of the United States not to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, decision that I fully support because the OAS and the Summit of the Americas is a summit that has to do with a commitment to a certain set of values. And we cannot relativize democracy. I mean, the Summit for the Americas cannot become what the UN is. I believe that the UN is highly dysfunctional because it has no value-oriented way of linking different countries. So we have the majority of the countries in the UN are dictatorships. And we have cases like the Human Rights Council, where we have China and Russia, and even Cuba as members of the Human Rights Council, when they are, the biggest violators of human rights all over the world. So I am all for a commitment that is strengthened around the values, around ideas that need to be defended. We cannot relativize democracy. We cannot relativize freedom. So I would hope that at least this discussion happens at the Summit of the Americas. There are some important countries from the Americas that want to go in the different direction. Mexico, for example, has been talking about, the relativizing democracy in much in the same way China is talking about that. And of course, the Caribbean countries changed their views after Maduro decided to write off $350 million of debt that they had with Venezuela because of oil shipments. And the week after that, they said, we are threatening not to go to the summit if Maduro is not invited. Well, I think we need to call their game. This is not what a summit should be about. A summit should be about democracy and freedom. And if democracy and freedom are not the priority in the Americas, then what we could expect for the rest of the world.
A final thought before I let you go is about your future plans, and not just your hopes for the future. I would assume you'd hope to return home someday to a more democratic Venezuela. But given the research that you're doing and how you're looking at the larger picture and the need for a global coherence on this issue, what are your hopes in terms of how much can be achieved on what type of timeline?
Well, as we spoke at the beginning, I hope that we can push forward through a negotiated agreement for free and fair elections. And that will require certain conditions, like the legalization of the political parties, the return of the exile, the freeing of the political prisoners. Those are some of the basic conditions that we hope to gain in the near future. Of course, that can happen or it cannot happen. You ask me, what am I going to do? I'm going to keep fighting. I mean, that's how I assume what I am. I'm a fighter for freedom, like many of us in Venezuela. I know this concept of freedom fighters, some people question it, but I can tell you that that's what we do. I went to prison for 7 years because I was fighting for freedom. My friends, several of them, have been assassinated by the regime because they were fighting for freedom in a non-violent way. Many of us are still in prison and others in exile. So yes, we believe that there needs to be a clear commitment to fight for something that we cherish and that we understand is the beginning of everything else. Because of course we hope for prosperity and the well-being of the Venezuelan people. But the gate that needs to open before any of that happens is the gate for freedom and free elections in our countries.
Well, thank you, Leopoldo. And certainly the personal price you've paid, no one can question your commitment. And it's an honor that the Wilson Center can provide you with a place to do your important research.
Thank you very much. And I would hope that after June, we'll now present the final paper. We can come again to your program and comment some of the topics discussed in the paper. So again, thank you very much. Thanks
I look
to
forward
your
to that.
audience.
Thank you very much. Our guest has been Leopoldo López. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.